Hitting record. All right, I just finished the message I was typing.
Nice.
Yeah, I actually sent. There's the little blurb that I posted is from Peter Wolfendale's essay on Hegel. He calls it the greatest mistake, and he sort of argues that Hegel, by authoring the phenomenology and what he argues failing to ground the phenomenology in the logic, which he purported to do, he actually made sort of this mistake that provides a conceptual ground for the future of transcendental philosophy. So he kind of like uses that as a way to ground his own project.
Interesting.
Yeah.
You'll have to send that in the resources or whatever.
I think it's the last message in the resources right now. It's short and sweet too. It's like 8 pages. So it's like a pretty quick read if you want to kind of see what Wolfendale is up to with his transcendental realism.
Oh, nice. You're kind of making a correlation between Heidegger and Hegel.
Yeah, because we touched on it last time, but we didn't get to elaborate it too much.
That symbiosis between self and world, I think that Chris was talking about. I think that just like there's such a resonance, I think, in Heidegger and
I think the sort of
Hegel's
like one of the sort of central differences, there's the similarity in that they're both interested in like the ordinary structure of consciousness in some way. Like Hegel is looking at how we direct ourselves towards the world in sensuous certainty or in just how our knowledge kind of immediately presents itself. And Heidegger, takes up our behavior and our knowing of being and beings through our average, like ordinary everydayness.
Yeah, that's right.
And so they both kind of start with these sort of like natural consciousness sort of figures, and then talk about sort of like going away from that or showing how that natural consciousness is insufficient for understanding being or for understanding the relationship between being and subject or subject and object.
Yeah.
But I think the crucial difference is between like Heidegger, he's interested in trying to show how natural consciousness is dependent upon a more originary sort of ontological foundation, this donation. It's like a matrix, like this horizon that Dasein finds itself immersed in its worldedness. And then Hegel is saying, instead of looking at this natural consciousness and finding something ever more primordial, ever more originary, he looks at it as the standpoint that must be sublated and overcome, where some aspects of its directedness is preserved, but ultimately were found in this sort of non-intentional consciousness that sort of overcomes the sort of relationship between subject and object by positing their identity. And so the sort of like content of the concept is investigated imminently in Hegel, and ultimately intentionality is sublated in favor of this sort of absolute knowing, which is the standpoint of science. So I think the differences in there, and I think you can almost see it as like Heidegger is like trying to uncover more and more primordial secrets, whereas like Hegel is kind of ascending upwards and like going to new heights of knowledge, new heights of knowing and subjective awareness. So I think it's an interesting way of kind of like conceiving of the differences between their projects, for sure.
Yeah, that's fascinating.
Let's see.
So is Adrian joining us today, or is it just us four?
Well, I sent him a message. I just texted him.
Yeah, he should be.
Yeah, he's not in the Discord, so I don't think he sees like when I send out an announcement.
I think he is.
Is he in the Discord? I thought he hadn't joined yet.
Yeah, it looks like he is.
He's there. Yeah, Dr. Adrian. Well, I sent him a text as well with the link and told him that if he can't jump on, that we can go ahead and go anyways. And I sent it to him about 10 minutes ago, and I haven't heard anything. So we might as well just go ahead and start talking. So we left off last time sort of like having just finished or having just started talking about perception, right?
Yeah.
I think we got through sensuous certainty, kind of talked about the heres and nows, talked a little bit about the sort of like, it's almost like a primitive posit, just like these sort of simple unities that are supposed to be particular, but then prove to be partaking in some element of the universal by persisting over time and by relating itself to itself and not being sort of dependent on the subject's positing of it, and it instead becomes the very movement of positing. And then he kind of uses that to transition to perception, which kind of knows itself according to this universal. And this is where he starts to talk about, right, like the manifoldness of these sort of that partake in the heres and nows, or the universal here and now in the this. And so he's almost like looking at how there's some sort of structure to the concept that when it's constituting objects and when it's sort of like first gathering objectivity, it sort of posits here-ness and now-ness and thisness in order to individuate and create or determine an object as such.
Yeah, one thing I was gonna note is the interesting kind of after the colon of perception or the thing and deception, and I think the second word there, deception, is really interesting because I think that's basically his conclusion about the his imminent critique of perception is that it is in fact deceived the self, the consciousness as perception deceives itself by assuming that it can very easily hold together the universal one of the object and the many of its properties.
Yes.
But in fact, that's actually held together by the subject itself, that the object itself can't actually reconcile those two differences. And it's, the very last line of the section on page 79, at least in the Miller volume, it, meaning the subject, does not secure them their truth, but convicts itself of untruth. So the idea here being that the subject, thinking it has secured the truth of the one and the many in the object, actually, in positing such, convicts itself of the untruth that it itself is what can reconcile the one and the many, and I think that's the basic problem he's getting at in perception is one of identity. There's no way of determining the identity of an object through its properties, because identity or these properties assume determinateness, and thus negation. So the whiteness would be negated by, blackness or other properties that then can't be held together in their own determinateness. Sorry, that's probably not a useful way of saying it, but that was kind of, to me, kind of the broad high level of this section, and really getting at the problem of the also, the universal and the also, and these two, the subject really being responsible for them and holding them together, but tricking itself that they're actually facets of the object.
It's almost as if the subject posits that these things are in truth, like for the object itself.
Right.
But ultimately, like, as we know as observers of this consciousness, what he's tarrying with is only the object for it. And that ultimately it almost undermines its own credibility. It no longer is able to be fallible because it's sort of like taking what its conceptual structure and determinations of the object and trying to posit that as universal for the object, when in fact it's not considering the object as it is in essence or in itself.
Right. And I do think one of the key points that he wants to make in getting back to the dialectical movement he's making, when you start with sense certainty, you realize, oh wait, immediately I'm moving into the universal as I start to speak. And so perception is the consciousness's attempt to create what he calls a sensuous universality. And that's going to be important, I think, because force and understanding is going to try to critique sensuous universality, but end up proving to fail in its own attempt to establish itself. But this idea that universality can be grounded in the sensory is the real problem he's trying to, I think, dismantle in this. I'm trying to find where he uses the phrase sensuous universality.
When he talks about sensuous universality and force and understanding, is that when he's talking about like those abstract laws that govern the intelligible world, or what is that what he's talking about?
So there, I think it's actually the supersensible. So
supersensible. Sorry,
those
yes,
are.
right.
So that's what I mean when he said. I think force and understanding is trying to remedy the critiques he levies against perception.
Yes.
But then again, he's going to show how it really leads to its own problems. It's in section 130 on page 77, where he says this term. Thus, the singular being of sense does indeed vanish in the dialectical movement of immediate certainty and becomes universality, but it is only a sensuous universality.
Right.
My meaning, it has vanished, and perception takes the object as it is in itself. So here we see that the universal is this kind of sensuous. And again, this great line, he has some of these great lines down in 130. The sophistry of perception seeks to save these moments from their contradiction, and it seeks to lay hold on the truth. Sophistry being this kind of posturing, this kind of attempt to compel through rhetoric.
Yeah.
It's as if, perception tries to act like it isn't this inherent contradiction of the one and the many, but it really is.
Yeah, that bit on the one and the many, I took it as like a sort of independent, like he was analyzing this independent of consciousness, but of course, like this is part of the project, incorporating consciousness in the way it makes sense of objects and this sort of thing. But like the way that properties inhere in the object, and then like what kind of makes the essential nature of the object, and how like and how the like object isn't just a sort of sum of its part of all of its like determinate properties, but that he kind of goes between this like, what is this essential thing that holds these things together, or the substratum that might hold these things together, or is it just kind of like the many properties that make up the one that grant its sort of essential it's sort of
it's not able to remedy the problem of what's essential and unessential in the object, and I think that's where he even says that either you choose the side of the universal and you end up back in sense certainty, where all you can just say is this is the object and you can't actually predicate anything of it, or you end up predicating all these other things and then you end up in contradiction because you can't actually say which of them is essential, and you can't actually hold them together as
that's very helpful.
Makes that essential,
That's very helpful.
Let's see here. What other notes do I have? Yeah, one other thing I was going to note is the importance, at least as it relates to identity or essence, is it something being determinate, and that language being really crucial for him. Even in section on page 71, where he kind of lists out in the broken up one, I find many such properties. So he kind of goes into this phenomenology of perception. One another, but are mutually indifferent, whiteness shouldn't have anything to do with cubeness. You know, there is no necessary relation between those properties. And so now it's skipping down. So now it is a universal common medium. So the salt is just the medium of all these properties. It's just where all these properties meet, in which many properties are present as sensuous universalities, each existing in its own account and as determinate, excluding the others. And there's that key line, excluding the others. So if these things are determinate, they must exclude these other properties. They must show themselves to be wholly unique to that object. And so none of them can simultaneously be universal and determinate. So I think that's really the key point his argument is making, that we can't name an object as determinate without ending up in this one in the many problem. It really can't be remedied outside of a universal postulating self-consciousness. Yeah,
it says something, right? Like in paragraph 114, something along the, according to their opposition, the properties, the determinate properties that are differentiated, but that nevertheless persist and permeate each other in the same unity, could not be together in the simple unity of their medium. And I'm reading a different translation, so it might be slightly different, which is as essential to them as is negation. Insofar as their difference within that unity does not amount to an indifferent difference, but rather to an excluding difference, which itself amounts to a difference which negates others, so this difference thus falls outside of this simple medium. The simple medium is not only and also an indifferent unity, it is also a one, an excluding unity.
Yep.
So
great find. Yeah, exactly.
I'm trying to, so then it starts to postulate determinateness relies on negation. And through the unity with negation is universality. But then as one set free from this unity, it is in and for itself. So there's this sense in which, I guess, the sort of negations or the excluding, the ways in which the determinations are, not one another, in which they don't necessarily share any properties, right? Because they're part of the also. So like the tartness of salt and its cubical properties are opposed to one another because they're not together in any way. But that these determinations end up partaking in something higher than it, which would be, I guess, the concept or the notion. And then he talks about the truth of perception reaching its culmination, and he lists out, right, like the alpha, beta, gamma.
Yeah, one of the things I wanted to mention in this is, I think, a really profound point that is going to come up later and going to be used in later philosophy is the relation of properties to identity. And and there's a sense in consciousness that when I interact with the object, there is a kind of, that object is more than the sum of its properties, right? And there's a way in which, in the phenomenal sort of level, you recognize these properties, and yet what Hegel's pointing out is consciousness always moves back to the sense of the singularity of the object in consciousness, that there is this, and we get this sense when we interact with human persons most of all, right? That when I interact with Esteban, the properties of Esteban couldn't equate to the singularity of me interacting with Esteban. I'm not interacting with somebody with glasses, somebody who studies philosophy, somebody who's this and this and this. If I were to say that, I wouldn't be saying the same thing as I'm interacting with Esteban. There's a there's a sense in which the unity of the object, the oneness of the object, sort of explodes its relation to those properties, and I think the way that he's setting this problem up kind of helpfully demonstrates how consciousness always returns back to the one, and always sort of can't get rid of that. And this is going to be a problem, I think, for Force and Understanding as well, is that it can't actually handle the way in which the sensible world presents the object to consciousness, and positing this super sensible. But I think that the problem of relating properties to the universal is, I think, really prescient for some of the other things that are going to happen later in phenomenology, particularly like Levinas, who's going to talk about the experience of the infinity in the face of the other, things like that, where the universal leads into this beyondness that just summarizing the properties are not going to sort of equate with.
Yes.
Yeah, because, right, like just listing properties doesn't give us enough information to really determine how that individual came into being and to what kind of properties it might have later on. And so there's some sense in which these determinations can take on another life given a new moment in its development, right? And given a new point in time even.
Sorry, I haven't visited perception for a minute now. I've spent a lot of this time visiting revisiting self-consciousness. So
Totally,
I'm like kind of on that right now.
You're good.
But
another key line here I will just I guess draw our attention to in 118, right at the end of the section. The behavior of consciousness, which we have now to consider, is thus so constituted that consciousness no longer merely perceives, but is also conscious of its reflection into itself, and separates this from simple apprehension proper. This to me is, again, another key line where he's saying, hey, we think perception is merely apprehension of the object, but really there's a actual self-reflective comprehension of the object, that needs the subject to then make this distinction between property and singularity, that he's going to say is the work of consciousness, not the work of the object. So I think that's probably a good summary line there.
Yeah, and it's like here where the pole kind of switches, right? Where the object becomes the inessential and then the subject becomes the essential. Because he then states,
great point.
In 119, we are thus the universal medium within such moments dissociate themselves from each other and in which each is on its own. Thereby, since we regard this determinateness that we are the universal medium as our reflection, we perceive the self-equality and the truth of the thing, namely its being one.
Nice, yeah, bang on. Right, yeah, and 121, positing these properties as a oneness is the work of consciousness alone, which therefore has to present them from collapsing into oneness in the thing.
Yeah, I like this dialectical movement between the sort of the way consciousness works, and then the object does kind of presents itself to consciousness, and this kind of that's how it never sort of stabilizes itself in either the essential or in the one or the many. It kind of maintains that dialectic in order to preserve the objectivity of that thing and the way that consciousness perceives it.
Right, and it's ultimately going to lead to where I think he's going to go in self-consciousness of what does hold this together. It's the transcendental subject, where we're going to head into, his real, kind of pseudo-Kantian answer that's then going to go beyond Kant. But here I think he's setting the ground for why a sensuous universal without a transcendental subject falls apart.
Yeah, because here it's almost we're struggling to find exactly like where the determinations are coming from. And in order to do that, you kind of need this notion of apperception. You need to be able to talk about how the subject is taking it as something or putting it under a concept. It's not purely in the universal of the subject as such or the object, but in this weird sort of transcended or more universal space of the concept, whose content kind of determines both subject and object.
Right. And even more the unity of consciousness, that we experience the object as a formal unity and not as whiteness, cubeness, tartness. Sequentially, we receive it as that singular unity. And that's, I think, going to be key for this section and really his whole critique of consciousness outside, but consciousness that thinks of itself outside of a transcendental kind of frame. I think I'm running out of my thoughts on this section. I don't know about anybody else.
Yeah.
Do we want to go on to Force and Understanding for a second? I haven't visited these sections in
I wanted to talk about one more thing here in perception, because I think it's kind of setting up a trend for me, and I guess the way that he's structuring these passages here, where it's like the first few paragraphs of perception, he kind of like sets out generally some of the logical considerations that are going on with the various terms that we're dealing with the properties, determinateness, indifference, the abstract universal medium, thinghood, one here, all of these different terms that kind of take on further development later on. And then he kind of steps back, and he says, let's see what consciousness learns. Let's see how consciousness goes through these terms and through these posits and how they sort of start to develop. So it's almost like he's giving us the groundwork for working through a chapter, and then he kind of like sets this experiment into motion. And I guess that's part of the Bildungsroman aspect of his work, where it's very much about this kind of coming to fruition of consciousness. But yeah, I think we can go on to Force and Understanding.
I don't know about you guys. This was, I think, on first read, one of the hardest things I've ever read.
I texted both, I think you, Christy, and PJ earlier. I was like, wait, what's happening here? I mean,
I've heard people say this is the hardest section in the whole phenomenology. Forced understanding.
Just because when I thought force, I thought immediately, like, how is he, from sensuous certainty into perception, I thought he was going to go into a more phenomenological account of, like, this. I mean, of course, he's developing that, but then force, I thought, like, this is a very, like, material, like, physics. Like, he's talking about physics, right? And, like, these sort of material, sort of operations of nature or something. And I thought it was really interesting. That's kind of like...
I think this section, when I first read it, I didn't know any of the I didn't know that force was even used as a term in like Aristotelian and Newtonian science.
Right.
That was like how they described the activities of, magnetism and gravity. And like, I didn't know, I was like, what is force? Like, and in some ways it actually, I first was like, is this like, Star Wars kind of shit, or like, what the hell is this? George Lucas read this chapter. I mean, I'm like,
truly.
But I think that background, once kind of I put it in that more like science frame, that really helped. Somebody described it as this is Hegel's critique of kind of a scientific realism. That science is kind of the way in which the true, like there of the world, and that through science, through understanding, we can arrive at what the object really is. And so his kind of critique of that naive kind of scientism, evidenced in, still probably today.
Yeah, well, and I think also what he's kind of doing with this chapter as well is addressing maybe some concerns with like Humean skepticism. And I think like one of the things that Hume does not want to, or wants to kind of purge from our knowledge, is certain statements about like causal relations and like necessary inferences and what might be called like nomological, right? Like law-like knowledge of physical laws and the sort of relations that govern sort of objects and their material relations. So I think maybe part of what he's trying to get at here is kind of structuring how our concept can come to understand not only the determinations of the object as it is kind of like in itself, but also the relations that it has to other objects through the forces that are exerted on it and the kinds of things that go into constituting it, or the kinds of like mutual incompatibilities that objects might have. I'm not super far into this section yet, so
got it.
But yeah.
Yeah, there's a key line where I think really the goal, the kind of move or the dialectical beyond of perception that forced understanding is, I think, trying to articulate is this: okay, we couldn't find the universality within the sensuous realm itself. So now we need to posit that there is this kind of super sensuous realm that exists, that is accessible through understanding, that we can then really get to the inner world of the object. I think he uses that language. I was trying to see again where he uses that inner world language, but it's this idea that, science postulates, or force postulates, that there's actually this inner world of forces that are acting upon the object that are not readily accessible to the senses, and that's what the object really is.
I think here at 142 and 143 we have.
Yeah, he talks about inner being. On 143, it's nice. The true essence of things has now the character of not being immediately for consciousness. On the contrary, consciousness has a mediated relation to the inner being, and as the understanding looks through this mediating play of forces into the true background of things.
Yeah, and then right after that, he says the middle term, which unites the two extremes, i.e. the object to the senses, the understanding and the inner world, is the developed being of force, which for the understanding itself is henceforth only a vanishing. So this is where he goes really, this is where he uses the inverted world kind of stuff, where the object ends up becoming the least important thing in this frame of consciousness, where you have the understanding postulating this play of forces, or as he's going to talk later about, these laws that undergird the object, and the object ends up becoming a vanishing, a trivial part to that, and ends up inverting our interaction. Consciousness is actually inverted to focus more on the supersensible beyond of the inner world of the object, and put the object of the senses far away from us.
Yeah, it's almost as if we're discovering something new about the objective, that it's not just objects, but there's this universal behind it. And it's almost literally in the sense of like the universe is physically behind every object and realizes it through forces. This whole as a whole, or a universal, is what constitutes the inner, the play of forces, as that play's reflective turn into itself. Lexion des selben in sich selbst, in itself.
Yeah, he says in 144 too, to kind of go off of that, this is where we see the kind of supersensible language. Within this inner truth as the absolute universal, which has been purged of the antithesis between the universal and the individual. So kind of here is where this consciousness thinks it's moved beyond the problem of the one and the many, and has become the object of the understanding. There now opens up above the sensuous world, which is the world of appearance, a supersensible world, which henceforth is the true world. Above the vanishing present world, there opens up a permanent beyond. So yeah, I think, that's one thing too to note is this form of consciousness sees itself as, okay, there was this problem of the one and the many, the relation of object and properties. And now what we're really postulating is, let's get rid of those categories. Let's move to this scientific explanation of dialectic of forces, interplay of forces. It's all just sort of one connected, supersensible world, and so you can eliminate the problem of the one and the many, but you end up living in a world that isn't the world of appearances. You end up living in this supersensible beyond that only exists in the understanding. And that's going to be one of his key points too, is you end up falling back on the subject that's actually holding everything together.
That's a good point.
But ultimately, you're right. Like the subject doesn't end up being the essential part of it, though, right? Because what's mediating this all is spirit, right? So the subject is also caught up in the movement of the concept, which truly is what determines the content of the universal, right?
Where are you seeing the spirit stuff enter?
Well, I haven't seen it yet. I just know that, like, as far as I can tell, like, even though the subject does end up positing this sort of beyond to its appearances, like, it's only able to do so according to the resources of spirit.
I think that would be a way of defending Hegel against a kind of anti-scientism that I think might emerge from this section. I don't think I haven't seen him do that move here in this section. It seems like in this section he's saying, okay, this is still consciousness's last attempt at grounding universality in consciousness rather than in a transcendental subject. And basically this kind of scientific realism is trying to say, hey, we can gain the universal through kind of scientific explanation, scientific understanding of the object. But I think he's trying to show even this still requires a transcendental subject, that the universal still can't be accessed through a kind of supersensible beyond that sees everything as a play of forces or as a play of sort of natural laws. But I think you're absolutely right that those laws emerge through spirit, as spirit, which is where I think he would say, yeah, they could still be discussed. They could still be useful.
Just that they're meaningless without knowing how we apprehend them.
Right. Or that we don't see them as a product of the understanding, as if they have, and this is something he uses this language a lot here, is that the problem with laws is that we assume there's a level of necessity to them. And in fact, that necessity is only a kind of notional or tautological necessity, a matter of just redefining the terms, So what is the law of gravity? Oh, it's just that everything has to fall. And it ends up just being a kind of definitional necessity. Yeah. Well, that's just what gravity means. It's not actually postulating any new content. And he'll kind of get into that. I'm trying to remember exactly where he critiques law and force as providing no new content for the subject, and you kind of see this sort of in a lot of scientific explanation is, okay, well, why does this happen? Oh, because it has the property of that happening, and it ends up, oh, why did I get sick from eating that? Oh, it has the property of doing that, just has a bacteria that causes that.
Yeah.
That's no new content, that's just another way of saying, oh, when I eat this, I get sick.
We've just observed it enough times and given it a name.
Right, exactly, and so that's that kind of tautological or just, different way of saying the same thing problem.
Well, and I think part of where he goes into that is 149. He says, about towards the bottom of that part. It says, "It is expressed in law as the stable picture of unstable appearance. The supersensible world is thus a motionless realm of laws. It is, to be sure, beyond the perceived world, for this perceived world exhibits the law only through constant change. However, those laws are just as much current in the perceived world and are its immediately motionless likeness." So I guess in this sense, it's almost like these laws are something that structure the way that things appear to us. And I guess he's interested in knowing and how these laws help render the object more determinate for us. But I'm curious because I guess he didn't really criticize it too much there, but he does point out that it's almost this motionless underside to appearances, whereas I imagine what he's looking for is something that isn't sort of decided, that isn't a total an already totalized sort of realm, because he's always interested in seeing how we can go beyond what purports to be immediate, right? And so if these laws are supposedly the sort of immediate reality that undergirds appearance, he's trying to find some way in which that's contradictory to itself.
Right. Well, and he gets into that a little bit where he, in 150, he kind of gets at this problem of like having many laws. And it basically, he wants to get at how, where he says kind of the middle of 150, however, insofar as it is not law in general, but a law, it does not contain determinateness. Consequently, there are indefinitely many laws. But this plurality is rather a defect, for it contradicts the principle of the understanding, for which, as consciousness of the simple inner world, the true is the implicitly universal unity. It must therefore let the many laws collapse into one law, just as, for example, the law by which a stone falls and the law by which the heavenly bodies move have been grasped as one law. So I think what he's trying to get at there is like the more the understanding tries to conceptualize things through laws, it wants to move into the unity of consciousness, and thus becomes more and more removed from the world. It becomes more and more vague from our actual experience. It becomes, now we're just postulating these very generic singular laws that then end up saying nothing useful that actually is relevant for our specific character, as he calls it.
Yeah, it's like it moves from these particular laws that suddenly become collapsed into a more general or universal law.
Right.
And right after that, right, he says, the unification of all laws into universal attraction expresses no further content than that of the mere concept of law itself, which is posited as existing therein. Universal attraction only says this: everything has a constant difference with regard to everything else. So I guess here he's pointing out that laws, rather than sort of purporting to give us, rather than actually giving us more sort of determinate knowledge of our place in the world or of the sort of world as it is in itself, it only gives us this sort of vague sort of description of differences and of there being differences that inhere in the world.
That's exactly right.
Where are we at?
Sorry, what were we going to say, Esteban? We were in 150, page 91.
Got it.
But he does still think, though, that this is a sort of important progress that we've made, right? Like, I don't think he's totally like anti-science in the sense that he's not like trying to dismiss these as achievements. He thinks that being able to discern laws behind the realm of appearances is a development, is an achievement towards the way of more accurate or more intelligible sort of understandings and rendering the world more intelligible.
Right.
It says at the end of that paragraph that the expression of universal attraction is of great importance because it is directed against the unthinking representation for which everything presents itself in the shape of contingency, and for which determinateness has the form of sensuous self-sufficiency.
I will say, I do think there is I definitely agree with your assessment, PJ. I will say the only thing that I do think is important is that he wants to critique the kind of naivete of science, that there is a kind of way of doing science that assumes it's reached kind of bare nature. And in fact, what's happened is the subject has enforced on nature a kind of standard, a kind of method of which only true nature will then be seen from. And he wants, I think, say, hey, as long as we recognize that's kind of our imposition on the object, rather than this kind of naive emergence of law or naive emergence of the object into consciousness, I think he'd be fine with it. That just then complicates a lot of scientific inquiry, and also complicates the nature of, or the relation of, method to truth or method to object. Because once you acknowledge that, kind of as Esteban was saying, why not music as the paradigm with which to access the object? Why not art as the paradigm to access the object? Science is just one way of imposing upon the object a certain question. And so I do think he would, and I think you see this in later continental thinkers like Ricoeur and Gadamer, who are going to put their finger on just this problem of the kind of scientific dominance, this kind of empirical dominance of the way of relating to the object that is problematic for, I think, Hegel and some of those later thinkers.
Yeah, that's certainly important. This sense in which he's not satisfied with merely the scientific understanding, and that oftentimes, and especially at this time period, science is, as you said, naively extending its reach to areas where perhaps it doesn't actually have any say. And oftentimes, I think science purports to have sort of absolutely infallible kind of knowings of the world. And like,
right.
I don't think that's as much true in contemporary natural science, but I do think that is true for some of the thinkers of the time period. Though there's some interesting sort of like studies of science at that time period, sort of after Hegel, where during that time we start seeing us become aware of extinction events and of laws that don't persist, of laws that end up contradicting themselves, whereby, there isn't something that persists. Like, there isn't just like the law of continual sort of change in evolution, but evolution is actually rife with discontinuity. And we start to realize this through understanding our like geological strata and how old the earth is and how the earth is structured by these sort of past histories that we've only just begun to uncover. But I think that's slightly after Hegel, and I think that marks a totally different understanding in our relationship to the world and the world's laws, and how they sort of adhere as somewhat contingent, because the laws are contingent on a certain configuration of reality as well.
Right.
So what about the electricity? Did y'all talk about the electricity?
I'm just reading over this now.
He goes on and kind of develops the way that sort of these play of forces as like, I'm trying to think where it's first introduced.
In 159, he uses this is where he gets into the inverted world and the supersensible, and uses magnetism.
Yeah, that's right.
And electricity is like an example.
That's what I thought it was.
So he says, so that to use is the bottom of page 97 in my version, so that to use the previous examples, what tastes sweet is really, or inwardly in the thing, sour, or what is North Pole in the actual magnet in the world of appearance would be South Pole in the inner or essential being. What presents itself as oxygen pole in the phenomenon of electricity would be hydrogen pole in unmanifested electricity. Was that what you were thinking of, Esteban, or something?
Yeah, I mean,
different.
even before he relates it to the inverted world, he kind of just, I think.
It's definitely one of the forces he's referencing is kind of just like out
Right.
there in the
I thought
world
it
of
was
science.
like, yeah,
sure.
as an analogy to make sense of.
What I think this does as well is set up really the question, at least in this inverted world section, and I would, I'm still kind of thinking my way through this, is like what takes priority as it relates to consciousness? Is it the immediate sensible, the immediate kind of interaction with the object, or is it this kind of beyond of the super sensible forces? And one thing that I think is critical is that even the world of the beyond is only accessed through consciousness, so that saying this is what's really happened is only happened through consciousness of the objects around you, and I think the dialectical, in some sense you could say the dialectic shows that this is the most mature form of consciousness, but also in a way shows you all the things you had to go through in order to get here, and sense certainty and perception. So there's almost like a dependency as well, so there's this kind of weird, way you could read it either way, of like, this is the, kind of culmination of consciousness, the most mature form, or the one that's most reliant on these more basic forms of consciousness, I don't know if that makes sense, but I think that's kind of one question kind of rolling in my mind.
It's like a Matryoshka doll, right? Like it's like
right.
Level of consciousness contains within it the other ones beneath it.
Yeah, it was kind of the stuff we were talking about last week, right, with Adrian, and just the inner containing of these other forms in these more mature forms that is kind of pregnant with all these other things. And yeah.
I might have to bounce soon, guys, but
oh yeah.
Well, did we want to go any further? I know, PJ, you said you hadn't read much.
That's the thing.
Past this, yeah.
I mean, like, how far? We haven't. Oh, we're getting sort of towards the end of this chapter. So I guess if you want to try to if we want to work through some of these last few paragraphs here and kind of see if we can find any other good sort of little bits that we might want to elaborate, I'd like to do that. I think that'd be good, because I think this bit about the inverted world is kind of confusing me a little bit. Especially when he starts talking about how like the sort of, if something were black in itself, it would appear white to us, and as insofar as it is like the inverted world. But
I thought the inverted world kind of model was based off of like the Kantian model. That's why I used intelligible earlier. Mm-hmm. But like the way Chris was talking about it and talking about the laws and the forces of the supersensible world, you're saying that that's all kind of contained in this like totalized unit or something, and that's why it's like a scientific. This is of a scientific persuasion, because it kind of comprehensively makes sense of the world, and in this sense, it almost exclusively through the sensible or something. Does that make sense what I'm saying?
Yeah.
I think what science is trying to do is it takes the sensible and then it tries to determine something about the supersensible from that, right? Like that's been the scientific standpoint since like Newton, is that we have the sensible world, but there's these little corpuscles behind it, these little movements that make everything happen.
Yeah,
right. Like I think Kant is somewhat skeptical of this notion that we can know like what's going on behind it, because ultimately it's all phenomenal knowledge, things that we can know and observe.
But you're saying this is like a microphysics behind it, not like a sort of
right, it's not just
abstract kind of thing,
because it's also like cosmological, right, where the scale would be much greater than us, where we're talking
for sure
about gravity. And so I think like I'm just trying to say like perhaps like science isn't only sort of like empirical, because it's also involved with these law-like statements, these trying to determine these law-like regularities. And like I think Hume is arguing that we can only know them as regularities and that we can't postulate them as sort of necessities.
That's interesting.
But I think some scientific ways of trying to understand the world need necessity in some way in order to argue that we're really knowing what's going on.
I guess it's the language of force, and then uses, like Chris was saying, these examples of like magnetism and these sort of laws of nature. I thought it was like he was describing material causal relations in the world, like and how these are these like comprehensively describe the totality of this image of nature.
And I think there is something right about that. I doubt Hegel would couch it in terms of material causal, but I think natural is certainly where we're going. Is like we're looking at how the world is sort of in itself without necessarily the sort of conceptual structures, right? We're like trying to say how it is independent of us. I guess he thinks that's misguided.
Does he talk about the concept of the infinite in this?
He does.
Yeah.
That's what I thought. That was an interesting point too. That helps mediate
160.
Yep. That's I remember that being pretty crucial.
It's at the very end of 160. It says, in that way, the supersensible world, which is the inverted world, has at the same time enveloped the other world and has it in itself. It is for itself the inverted world, which is to say, it is the inversion of itself, and it is itself and its opposed world within one unity. Only in that way is it the difference as inner difference, or the difference in itself, or is the difference as infinity.
Yeah, so, I said it's pretty tough.
Yeah. I do remember thinking like, what the like even with, I don't know if this is also referencing what PJ was saying earlier about like the black and then it's white and these sort of like contradictions or I don't know, oppositional properties between both worlds and how like I don't know.
Well, yeah, and that's what I don't quite understand, because he's saying it's almost as if he's setting up like this oppositional sort of structure between the sensible world and the supersensible world, right? Because he says in 158, what in the law of the first world is the North Pole and the magnet is in its supersensible in itself, namely in the Earth, the South Pole. And we talked a little bit about that, right? Talks about how the law of electricity is the oxygen pole, but in the other one is the hydrogen pole. But I don't see how the supersensible world like works like this. Like this doesn't make sense to me. Like this, how like just because something appears to be one way to me, why would it appear to be exactly the opposite way in itself? Like to me that's fallacious at least.
I thought like, yeah, I don't know if it's like he's trying to explode, like I don't know, reject this sort of like law of contradiction that necessarily governs, the world or something like this, and like how both, the thing and whatever, I don't know.
Yeah, I think part of it has to do with, now this is me just trying to think through it in the moment, but I think part of it, I have the same question, PJ. I think one of maybe the way he's trying to get is part of the whole definition, or at least the way understanding has taken forces, is again that they are all singularly one, that they all are an interplay of forces. So basically in the inverted world, what looks like the North Pole is also one as the South Pole, that they're actually these interplay of forces then become singularly, all connected with each other in a dialectical movement. So to say that something is the North Pole in the inverted world is also to implicate the South Pole, is also to implicate it as impacted by the South Pole. And so what you then see is that without these sort of dyads all interconnected to each other in the supersensible world, That's the only way you can make sense of the forces all interplaying with one another, all impacting one another.
That's what I thought. That's a good point.
But I can't see exactly where he says that. I'm only trying to connect the dots myself in terms of why he's creating these negations like that, or these sort of like opposites, these antinomies, as if the inverted world has to be the opposite. And that's the only thing I can think, is that they both become necessary with one another as you move into the supersensible, because that's exactly what force means. That they're all connected with each other. Yeah.
Well, and there's this I guess, like, I misinterpreted earlier, because I thought that he was setting up an opposition between the supersensible and the inverted. But then in this passage in 157, he says, what is equal to itself instead repels itself from itself, and what is unequal to itself instead posits itself as what is equal to itself. In fact, it is only with this determination that the difference is an inner difference, or is a difference in itself, while what is equal to itself is unequal to itself, and what is unequal to itself is equal to itself. This second supersensible world is in this way the inverted world. Namely, while one aspect is already present in the first supersensible world, this is the inverted version of this first supersensible world. The inner as appearance is thereby brought to culmination. So I guess when you posit a law in this supersensible world, you immediately also posit it as having some unequal or some inverted version of it.
What was the last you read from that, PJ?
The last what?
The last line of that you just
that
read?
I just read? Or
yeah.
It says the inner as appearance is thereby brought to culmination.
Yeah. It's like the realization of the exact opposite of the oppositional allows us to like transcend that perceptible realm by like realizing the direct opposite of it.
Yeah, I think you're right on. He says that in 156, where he says force splits into an antithesis, which at first appears to be an independent difference, but which in fact proves to be none. For it is the self same which repels itself from itself, and therefore what is repelled is essentially self-attractive, for it is the same. The difference created, since it is no difference, therefore cancels itself again. So yeah, it's like there's this, force initially creates this antithesis, these dyads that then become, he says, self-same. We see that there is in fact no difference between the North Pole and the South Pole. We in fact see them as one and the same. They are essentially attracted to one another, as he says, into this sameness, which is all what we're positing in the supersensible world of the understanding. I think that's what he's saying.
Would be good to mark that and maybe try to talk to Schweitzer and see what he's...
Yeah, totally.
But when I thought about that oppositional logic, I thought about earlier in the Sensuous Certainty, how he kind of explains the movements of the dialectic of the here and now, when he talks about when you posit the here and now and then you negate it and then there's a negation of the negation. I thought this is kind of what he was kind of unfolding with relation to the sensible and the super sensible, how like there is this dialectical development of these laws within these worlds.
It just it seems like, I guess my difficulty of it is it seems like sometimes he's trying really, really hard to apply specifically this dialectical sort of method of opposition into the fabric of reality, whereas like I have naturalist proclivities. I believe that natural sciences do determine the world in the best way possible, and that we should put our faith in scientific knowing. So to me, it seems like there's this sense in which he's trying to like impose a kind of like propositional structure onto the world by talking about this inverted world as setting up these oppositions that emerge from themselves. But like to me, it's almost like nonsensical. But like, I don't want to just dismiss Hegel out of hand, because I think what he's doing here is important, you know.
Sure.
Well, I think, to defend Hegel a little bit, I think he would say it's actually science who's doing the imposition, right? That's, I think, his whole point, is trying to say we're forcing these laws, we're forcing this description on the world as if that's what the world is, you know. And he's trying to show that what's really being described is the inner world of understanding, is actually the inner world of consciousness's attempts to create this super sensible beyond that isn't actually readily available to appearance. And so I think, you know, I'm not sure how, I think that critique is maybe still relevant. I'm not sure how the critique of these various forces and their antinomies, and that critique of like, that may be more relevant to the science of his day, may fall a little bit flatter. But I do think that critique of, one, seeing law as a kind of notional necessity rather than as a kind of any ontological or metaphysical necessity, I think that's still very relevant. You know, in some of those kinds of critiques, as well as the critique of science being a kind of devaluation of perception or of appearances.
I think that was crucial for me. Instead of like pitting them against one another, but seeing how it's always already mediated through perception.
Right, here we see in 165, he kind of drops the final conclusion or the final hammer. We see that in the inner world of appearance, the understanding and truth comes to know nothing else but appearance, but not in the shape of a play of forces, but rather that play of forces in its absolutely universal moments and in their movement. In fact, the understanding experiences only itself.
There it is.
Raised above perception, consciousness exhibits itself, closed in a unity with the supersensible world through the mediating term of appearance,
right,
through which it gazes into this background. Yeah, I think that's the kind of key bringing together of the supersensible and the sensible end up becoming enclosed as a unity in the understanding itself, rather than any kind of positing of a real out there that gets beyond the appearances.
Yeah, that's really
right. And here, like, the in itself is part of the structure of appearance, because, you know, he's not talking about perception per se, where the in itself would remain accessible to us, because it appears as it is in itself to the understanding. Yeah, the very last part of this paragraph is great. It turns out that behind the so-called curtain, which is supposed to hide what is inner, there is nothing to be seen if we ourselves do not go behind it. And one can see something behind the curtain only if there is something behind the curtain to be seen. However, at the same time, it turns out that one cannot, with any more fuss, go straight away behind the curtain, for this knowing of the truth of the representation of appearance and of appearance's inner is itself only the result of a complex movement, through which the modes of consciousness that go from meaning something, then to perceiving, and then to the understanding itself all vanish. It likewise turns out that the cognition of what consciousness knows while knowing itself requires still further circumstances. The exposition of these circumstances lies in what follows.
Yeah.
So I guess part of what he's criticizing here is that with like naive realism about science, we start to posit these laws that are laws of appearance that we take to be laws of the in itself, but really they also have to do with our cognitive faculties, and to try to separate out our cognitive faculties from the laws that we posit and the ways that we understand those laws and those things as interconnecting, we're sort of extending, unwittingly extending a sort of parochial understanding onto the universal, and creating a false universal out of those laws.
Right.
Well said.
Yeah, and I think, you know, to your earlier kind of point as a way of kind of reconciling or just trying to really get at Hegel's true kind of philosophy of science, you know, he said, as you kind of quoted, there is nothing to be seen unless we go behind it ourselves. You know, so that this kind of going to the inner world already is an expression of, you know, is the term he's going to use later, of desire, of wanting to ourselves see something more. You know, so there's a more complex movement, you know, of actually going behind. You need us as desiring beings before you can get to the inquiry of seeing the inner truth to the thing. You know, so I think that's where he's gonna, you know, kind of hold the two together, you know. So yeah, that's a great point.
It's interesting here because I think this chapter is where you can kind of see a dovetail between like Hegelian thought and like Nietzschean thought, where it's almost as if for like Nietzsche, this sort of difference in itself repels us. We're not able to.
I gotta go, guys. I'm sorry.
You're good.
You're good.
See you, Esteban.
Yeah. Thanks for dropping in. Where it almost repels us, so we're not able to like want to know the world as it is in itself. Like it's pure will to power, right? It's just this sort of different, these different forces acting against one another, and our attempts to know them, we're just casting ourselves into the void almost. And I think there's also a difference, you know, like Deleuze is very interested in difference as it is in and for itself. And in order to achieve this, he thinks that you can't subordinate difference to these sort of conceptual trappings. You can't tie difference to the identity of the concept. But, you know, Hegel very much does think that, you know, in order to discover this difference, we're constantly sort of putting it in terms of like infinity or in terms of our cognition of it. Whereas Deleuze is very interested in that like sort of ontological stratum that difference kind of generates for itself these new sort of intensities. But that's like totally, it's like part of his anti-Hegelian project is kind of like trying to break down this sort of seeing of the world or seeing the world in terms of its necessary correlation with us. So yeah, I don't know. That's just my observation. I'm really interested in the Deleuzian project, and I'm fairly familiar with Deleuze. So I'm always kind of reading Hegel through his sort of rudimentary anti-Hegelian. I'm not committed to it because I've heard so many critiques from people who are critical of Deleuze that Deleuze and other French philosophers at that time had a fairly hostile understanding of Hegel, and that they weren't being particularly gracious when they were reading him and interpreting him. So there is something to be said of their sort of unwillingness to entertain the idea of totality or the absolute or the universal as like part of a fascistic ideology or whatever. So, but yeah.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating.
Yeah.
No, and I think it'll be interesting too, you know, as you read the section on desire, if you're seeing how you're seeing kind of coordinates with Deleuze, as that'll be a key, you know, section for that. I mean, I feel like this self-consciousness section, it's really like you could look at the history of modern philosophy and just see which section people absolutize out of it, you know, whether it's lordship and bondage or desire, or, you know, his section on the unhappy consciousness, you know, all of them, whether it's lit or existentialism, Marxism and neo-Marxism, or some of the, you know, desire stuff with Nietzsche and those following him. I mean, I think it's all here in the self-consciousness section. So it's going to be a ride.
There's this great conversation I might post in the Discord between Ray Brassier and Ian Hamilton Grant about Hegel and about some of the sort of maldispositions that French philosophers hold to him. So
interesting. Well, I think Sartre also was like a huge critic, had a critique of Hegel as well, particularly some of his stuff in Sense Certainty. So
yeah, I'm not super familiar with Sartre at all. So I
haven't read them since college, so yeah, I don't. I'm not an expert either.
Yeah, I haven't actually touched. I think I've read some of Nausea, and that's it. But I've just heard so many bad things about Sartre's work, and it just doesn't appeal to me as much as some of the more like post-phenomenological figures in French philosophy, especially. So.
Yeah, I'd rather read Merleau-Ponty than
exactly. Yeah,
and Sartre probably. Yeah,
Heidegger, even Beauvoir is more interesting. So, yeah,
for sure. No, I'm with you on that. He's kind of like, you get one idea from him, great. Mortality, death.
Radical
that's the
freedom.
thing. Right.
Yeah, I know.
Right. Yeah. Anyways, I got to get rolling. Absolutely great to talk to y'all.
It was.
Cool. See y'all next week.
Thank you. Bye.
Absolutely, y'all.
Yeah.